The Zags have 2 roster spots available ahead of the 2023-24 season. Are they going to fill both spots, one spot, or perhaps stick with the roster they already have? We'll discuss all of that right here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Don't go away.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to give you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the Locked On Podcast Network. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. All right, folks, we are taking a look at roster construction today as kind of the dust has begun to settle on roster movement for the season. We're going to look at how Gonzaga might utilize their final 2 open scholarships right now. We're also going to take a look at some lineup and rotation questions, what we think might happen, different varieties of what this lineup and rotation might look like for Mark Few and the Zags next season. We're also going to wrap up the show discussing Courtney Vandersloot, the start to her first season in New York with the Liberty, as well as some comments she made recently about what she may want to do with her post-playing career, wrapping up the show with that. But first, I want to talk about the remaining part of Gonzaga's men's basketball offseason. Because as the dust has settled, as we now know that Anton Watson is returning to school, we now know that Malachi Smith is not returning to school, we have a much better sense of what everything is going to look like. It's still not finalized, and I think that's kind of where I want to lead the show, because as of right now, the Zags have 2 open scholarships, 13 scholarship players for every men's basketball program. The Zags have 11 of those all wrapped up. They have the 6 returners on scholarship, which would be, of course, Anton Watson, Ben Gregg, Nolan, Hickman, Braden Huff, Caden Perry, and Jun Seok Yeo. That is your 6 returners. Again, Yeo was added last season in the middle of the season, so he counts as a returner on scholarship. 5 newcomers on scholarship, of course, the 3 transfers in Ryan Nembhard, Graham Ike, and Steele Venters, as well as the 2 incoming freshmen in Dusty Stromer and Alex Tui. And then you have your 4 non-scholarship players, the walk-ons, Joe Few, Abe Eagle, Colby Brooks, and Kellen Mitchell. So that's your roster right now. Again, 2 additional spots they could use. And for this segment here, I just want to go through each of the options effectively on what they could or could not do with those spots. Option 1 would be to fill both spots. And filling both spots could be done a handful of different ways. To be honest with you, I think this is unlikely. I think the Zags will either fill 1 spot or they will fill 0 spots. Again, filling both spots could include 2 transfers. It could include a transfer and a late class of 2023 player. It could include adding a class of 2024 player who reclassifies. It could be a variety of different things. There's lots of different options here. A player who, something like what Nolan Hickman did, where he decommitted from Kentucky and then ended up coming to Gonzaga. Like, those things could happen. Again, transfer portal options are here. I think the challenge with adding 2 players right now is everybody knows that Mark Few plays 8 players pretty much maximum. I was going to say sometimes 9, but rarely 9. Typically his rotations are 8. Sometimes they are 7. Occasionally they are 9. The Zags already have more than that on the roster, and the majority of those players need to play. Some of them I think maybe won't play. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm not sure how much playing time Alex Tui is going to get as a freshman. Certainly health concerns with Caden Perry are on the factor as well. We'll talk a lot more about Yeo in the second segment and kind of where he is at and what that might do for the roster. But by and large, I think it's safe to say that Gonzaga does not have room for 2 more players to come into this program who are both going to play significant minutes. I think I almost don't, unless something changes, there's no way. They just do not have room for that. They might have room for 1 more player. And I talked about this extensively with UC Riverside transfer Zion Pullen, who has listed Gonzaga in his top 5 alongside LSU and Florida and Michigan and Xavier. And is a guy that I think could really fill a Malachi Smith type role. He's a 6'4" guard, scored 18 points per game last year, high level defender, really good outside shooter, like kind of fits a lot of what Malachi Smith was. And I think that adding a player like that could make sense. You could find a spot for him in a rotation, but you can't add him and Connor Vanover. You can't add him and David Muoka from UNLV. You certainly can't add him and another guard. You just don't have room for that many additions. I just don't see them adding 2 transfers. That almost seems impossible to me. If they were to fill 2 roster spots, I could potentially see them adding a transfer like Zion Poland, let's use him as the example, as well as a incoming freshman. Again, maybe it's a freshman who decommits from another school. Maybe it's a yet to be committed 2023 freshman. There aren't very many of those left, certainly not very many that would be of the caliber of a Gonzaga basketball player. But again, somebody could decommit, reclassification could happen. There are ways, an international player potentially like Yeo was last year. Like there are ways that they could fill both roster spots where they don't necessarily need both those players to play right away. Adding a freshman or an international freshman in particular, like Yeo was, like Tui, like Rui was, where they come in, they take up a scholarship spot, but they're not really in the mix for playing time right away. I think that's possible. I don't know that this is super likely, but I do think that it is reasonable that that could happen. Again, I think 2 transfer additions is almost certainly not going to happen. I'm not even sure if 1 transfer addition is going to happen, although I think that is certainly possible. But 2 transfer additions isn't going to happen. And I really honestly would just be surprised if they filled both these roster spots at all. Mark Few and the staff have frequently gone into the season with an open scholarship. There's a variety of things they can do with that. They can fill it by putting a walk-on on scholarship. They have done that in the past. Matthew Lang earned a scholarship. I'm sure Mike Hart earned a scholarship. I'm pretty sure Jeremy Jones earned a scholarship. Like there are walk-ons who earn scholarships frequently. That is not uncommon at all. And I think for Gonzaga, especially if they keep 2 open scholarships, which we'll talk about that option later, they could definitely use that to give it to somebody who's on the roster already who doesn't have a scholarship. Option 2 would be filling 1 spot and leaving 1 spot open. And I'll say this right now, I think this is the most likely. And I think a lot of people think the most likely scenario is they keep both spots open. And I think that is more likely than them filling both spots. But for me, filling 1 spot and leaving 1 spot open feels the most likely. And there are a handful of ways they could do that. Again, we already mentioned adding a transfer. Adding Zion Poland out of UC Riverside and calling it an offseason makes sense to me. Poland is a guy who, again, fills a Malachi Smith type role. You have Nembhard, you have Hickman, you have Steele Venters, you have Dusty Stromer, so you may not necessarily need another guard. Venters can kind of play more of a 3 role. It depends how confident you feel in Stromer being an immediate contributor for this team. But adding a guy like Poland to either start or play big minutes off the bench, be, back-to-back WCC 6 men of the year in transfer guards could be a fun thing for Gonzaga to try to accomplish with this team. But I think more than likely, if they fill 1 spot and they leave 1 spot open, again, I think a transfer could be the option. But again, I think this could also be a spot where, hey, we add an international player, maybe a guy who wasn't on the radar for a lot of people. Somebody like Yeo was, where he kind of just showed up pretty unexpectedly. That was not something that was really on the radar for a lot of people when he ended up coming to campus. Find somebody like that, add them, know that they're, either going to redshirt entirely or not be a part of the picture at all, but they're going to take a scholarship spot and be a developmental piece that maybe contributes to this team next year or even the year after that. I think that makes a lot of sense because I really don't think that there's a lot of room in the rotation right now. And again, we'll talk more about my projections for the rotation in the second segment. But right now, there's maybe 1 spot open for somebody like Poland or a player of that caliber, but that's really all that I see. And I don't see them adding players just to add players. They're going to add players who are either contributing right now, which they don't have a lot of room for, or who they fully envision being contributors down the line. There are some transfers that might fit in that mold. I've talked about a player named DeMarco Dunn from the University of North Carolina. I doubt he's going to transfer somewhere where he's not going to play. I think if anything, he would transfer to a program that is maybe not as doesn't have as much depth as Gonzaga, where he's going to step into a bigger role. I don't blame him for that. But if there's a player that Gonzaga can identify who could transfer in, sit some time, and then maybe develop within the system, they could try to look for that. But that doesn't always work. That's what they tried with Efton Reed, and it didn't work because he decided he wanted to leave. I don't blame him, for the record. I'm not saying anything negative about him, but in this era, adding players with the hope that, hey, we're going to get this guy who's transferring and hope that he spends 3 years in the program growing and developing. Guys aren't necessarily as willing to do that. And that makes it a little bit more difficult for Gonzaga from a roster construction standpoint, because you want 8-9 guys who are playing and then everybody else on your roster to still have a role. And a lot of that role is developing in the system and becoming a guy who contributes later on. That's what we hope is happening with Braden Huff. That's what we hope happens with Alex Tui. That's what we hope happened in a half year with Yeo. Like those are the kind of things we want to see. And it's just a little bit more rare in college basketball these days. The last option, of course, is leaving both spots open. And I think a lot of people think this is the plan. If the rotation is set, which we'll talk about more, why add players to kind of make it muddier? Like, don't add players just to add players. If they're good with the guys that they have, leave those roster spots open. Give one of them to a walk-on. Give both of them to a walk-on. Put Colby Brooks and A. Beagle on scholarship. I don't care. Or don't. Put one of them on scholarship. Leave that spot open if you want a mid-season acquisition like they had with Yeo. If you want a player who decommits from somewhere else and you pop them onto an open scholarship. Like, there are a lot of options they could use for those final two spots. And I think while I mentioned that adding one scholarship player and leaving a spot open is the most likely, I also wouldn't be shocked if the rumors that a lot of people are hearing that Gonzaga is not planning to use either of their final two scholarship spots, I wouldn't be shocked if that ends up being the case either. So what might Gonzaga's rotation look like? We've teased a lot, but that's what we're going to talk about in the second segment, and we're going to get just into that conversation right now after a word from today's sponsor, FanDuel. Grand slams, no-hitters, and double plays are back, and there is no better place to get in on the MLB action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. That's because right now, new customers can step up to the plate with a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon, sign up, place your first bet, and get up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if you do not win. I know Marco Gonzalez just went on the injured list, but when he's back, if you want to bet on him to get a win for the Mariners, or you Zag fans could bet on Eli Morgan, who pitches for the Cleveland Guardians, you could bet on him to get a save. Either way, don't miss your chance to get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. All right, folks, want to thank all of you for making Locked On Zags your first listen or your first watch of the day. And for you everyday listeners, we got much, much more coming your way about Gonzaga's lineup, about Gonzaga's rotation. We will continue to look at transfers the Zags could add if we think that is a direction the Zags are going to go. And of course, as we are now in June and NBA draft season, we will continue to look at Julian Strother's career, Drew Timmy's career, Malachi Smith, Rasir Bolton, where those guys might end up. And then, of course, as we get later into the summer, we'll continue to update you on pro Zags and everything else going on in the Gonzaga community. For right now, though, I want to take a look at next year's rotation, because Mark Few plays a tight 8-man rotation. Tight. Might be 7, probably won't be 9, probably going to be 8. So who's that going to be? Here's the way that I've laid it out. I have found 6 players that I believe are guarantees to be in the rotation. Of course, barring a significant injury or anything like that, these 6 players are going to be in the rotation. That is Anton Watson, who, of course, didn't come back to Gonzaga to play less than he did last year. He seems like a solid replacement for Drew Timme in a lot of ways. We'll see his offensive game potentially expand without Drew on the roster. I think he's a guy who's in line to be one of Gonzaga's highest leading scorers next season. Ben Gregg, of course, another returner who is in line for a potentially bigger role as well. A guy who really blossomed into a really good player last year. And I think we're going to continue to see him grow and develop next season. Graham Ike, he's the biggest question mark for me. He's going to be in the rotation as long as he's healthy. There are some questions about whether he will start, whether Watson and Gregg will start. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But unless Graham Ike is not healthy, which all indications right now are that he is fully healthy and ready to go, he is going to be in the rotation. He is way too good of a player to not be in Gonzaga's rotation next year. And then on the guard side, you have Ryan Nembhard, 35 minutes per game for a team that went to the Elite Eight last year. There is no doubt that he is the starting point guard and one of Gonzaga's best players next season. Nolan Hickman, there's a little bit of uncertainty about what his role is going to be next year, but he is absolutely going to be a part of the rotation, whether he is starting or not. And then Steele Venters, the transfer from Eastern Washington, guy who averaged 15 per game last year. Again, his role is a little bit unsettled. I think he could start. I think there's also a possibility he comes off the bench, but he is going to be in Gonzaga's rotation. So those 6 guys are locked in. Then I think there's 2 that are likely. And assuming these 2 players are in the rotation, that's your 8-man rotation right there. Those two players would be Jun Seok Yeo and Dusty Stromer. Stromer, true freshman, top 50 recruit. True freshmen don't always play in the rotation for Gonzaga. Julian Strother and Dominic Harris were both similarly regarded prospects in their respective recruiting class, and neither of them played big minutes. I think Strother played about 7 minutes per game, but he didn't play every night. Dom played 4 or 5 minutes per game, and he also didn't play every single night. So it's not a guarantee that Stromer will be in the rotation, but I think it's very likely that he will be, especially with Gonzaga not pursuing another guard. Again, if they do, that's what would push him potentially out of the rotation. But most of the scenarios that I have laid out involve Dusty Stromer being in the rotation. We'll talk more about Yeo, but the other players on this roster. So you have your 6 guarantees, your 2 likely guys in Yeo and Stromer. Your other players are Braden Huff, freshman last year who redshirted. He's still here. I don't think he would stick around if he didn't think he was going to play this next year. So that kind of makes him an interesting case for me, because I don't see an obvious spot for him in the rotation, but perhaps he could carve out his own playing time in his own way. And then you have Caden Perry, who of course, top highly regarded recruit, but has just dealt with massive injury issues with his ankle and his back. The reports right now are that he's healthy and that he's going to compete to play next year. I would love that. I think he's got some potential to be a kind of player that Gonzaga doesn't really have, and high energy big, a rim protector of that sort. And I think that if he does display those skills, that makes it hard to not play him. So that'll make an interesting case as well. And then Alex Toohey, the freshman coming in from Australia, player we don't know a ton about. I wouldn't be surprised if he plays very little next year. I also wouldn't be surprised if he redshirts next year, but a guy who is probably on the outskirts of the rotation right now, but is hopefully a guy who could develop within the system. And then of course you have the 4 walk-ons, Brooks, Eagle, Few, and Mitchell. None of those guys are going to play outside of garbage time minutes this year. I mentioned we're going to talk about Yeo later, because here's the deal. Trying to project what this rotation and starting lineup is going to look like is really difficult until we know what kind of player Yeo is right now. As a reminder, Yeo joined the team last year in the spring semester, again, very unexpectedly. He's from South Korea. He left South Korea to come to the United States to play for Gonzaga. He had played for their FIBA U19 team and dominated, was really, really good at the FIBA level. He is also 21. So he is not a wide-eyed, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed freshman the way that most freshmen are. He is still an international student, and generally international students take a little longer to adapt. They're obviously dealing with more differences than moving from, say, Texas to Washington versus South Korea to Washington. You're adjusting to a language barrier, you're adjusting to a cultural shock, you're adjusting to American college. Like, there's a lot of differences, and we've seen international players, some of them take a bit, some of them don't. Domantas Sabonis was pretty much awesome right away, although he was better as a sophomore than he was as a freshman. Sabonis, had some more experience in America than a lot of other prospects. But Shemet Karnowski struggled right away. Rui Hachimura took a couple of years to really kind of adjust to the American game before he kind of blossomed. Yeo is an interesting case because in theory, you could expect that it might take him a little bit of time, but he's also older and he's more physically mature. And I think he's more ready to contribute at this level. He's the biggest hinge for what Gonzaga's lineups could look like next year. And so what I want to do, because I think the range of outcomes for him is like as low as what Rui's freshman year looked like, where you're only playing garbage time, to a guy who plays 25 to 30 minutes per game and starts. I genuinely believe it could be any of those outcomes, which makes it impossible to fully predict what Gonzaga's lineup is going to look like next year. So what I want to do is do 3 different lineups. One where Yeo is not in the rotation, one where Yeo is in the rotation but isn't necessarily in the starting lineup, and one where he is in the starting lineup, and take a look at what that all might look like. So the first one is, I don't think this is particularly likely, but is a scenario where Yeo is just not a rotation player. This is basically freshman year Rui as Yeo this year. And this is the most likely scenario where Gonzaga adds a player in the transfer portal. Because if they do not, and Yeo is not part of the rotation, this is what I see. A starting lineup likely of Ryan Nembhard, Nolan Hickman, Steele Venters, Anton Watson, Graham Ike. In fact, I think that's a pretty likely starting lineup unless Yeo is ready to start right away. Unless he's ready, I think the starting lineup is probably that. I'll repeat it. Nembhard, Hickman, Venters, Watson, Ike. Your 6th and 7th men are Ben Gregg and Dusty Stromer. Again, you have to be confident that Stromer is ready for a big role right away as a true freshman. I'm not saying he's not. I'm just saying the staff is going to have to feel confident that he is in that spot. Your 8th man in this point is a little bit murkier. Is it Alex Toohey? Can Toohey play the 3? He's 6'7", 6'8", kind of listed as a small ball 4, but if he's capable of playing the 3, then he's probably your 8th man, because then you have a more reliable backup for somebody like Venters. If it's not Tui, is it Caden Perry or Braden Huff? If it's one of those guys, you're pretty short on guards. Could you play Ben Gregg at the 3? I don't know. I don't know if Ben Gregg can play the 3. Or Anton Watson. Could those guys play? Could they play bigger lineups where they have Ike, Gregg, and Watson all on the floor at the same time? I'm kind of inclined to believe they're not going to do that. I remember distinctly when Gonzaga fans wanted desperately to see a lineup with Shemet Karnowski, Domantas Sabonis, and Kyle Wiltshire, and we pretty much never got it. And those 3 guys are better combined, I think, than Watson, Ike, Gregg. Now, Watson, Ike, Gregg's a little bit more versatile, a little bit more spacing the floor capable than that lineup would have been. So there's differences. I don't want to say it's a straight across comparison, but in the past, when folks have wanted to see Gonzaga run 3 big lineups, it hasn't happened. And I would be kind of surprised if we see it out of this group. So if Yeo's not a rotation guy, I think the Zags are making an addition in the portal. And that kind of is one of the first indications we may get about how the staff views Yeo, because if they don't add anybody else, if they choose to stay put with the roster they have, in my mind, it's because Yeo is going to be a player who plays significant minutes next year. So let's look at what that might look like. This is a lineup of if Yeo is in the rotation, but not necessarily a starter. And again, it doesn't change all that much. Nembhard, Hickman, Venters, Watson, Ike is probably still your starting lineup. Ben Gregg, Yeo, and Stromer are your 3 off the bench. Bing, bang, boom. That is your rotation. And I like this rotation, because you have 3 bigs in Watson, Ike, and Gregg. You have 2 traditional point guards in Nembhard and Hickman. And then you have your kind of hybrid forwards in Venters, in Yeo, and to an extent Stromer. Stromer's not really a forward, but he's a bigger guard. He's 6'6". So he could play the 2. He could play the 3. I don't think he's going to play the 1 as a freshman. I'm honestly not sure he's going to play the 1, period, although he did in high school and he conceivably could, but he's not going to be a better point guard option than either Nembhard or Hickman, especially not in year 1. So I think that lineup gives you the most versatility. You have multiple options at the 1, you have multiple options at the 2, you have multiple options everywhere. You're missing a big center, but the Zags just don't really have that on the roster. So there's not really much they can do there. I think Yeo could play some small ball 4 in this potential lineup. Gregg obviously is going to play a lot of minutes. Watson and Ike are very capable post players. They're just not back to the basket scorers, but they're not rim protecting centers. They're both, I think, both under 6'10". So that'd be an issue there. Out of the lineup in this group would be Perry, Huff, and Tui. Again, all 3 of those guys will compete for minutes at the 4, 5, Tui potentially at the 3, but I think they're most likely out of the lineup going forward. Next one, Yeo is a starter and a big-time contributor. This is what would change the starting lineup. I think a feasible starting lineup in this situation would be Nembhard at the 1, Venters at the 2, Yeo at the 3, Watson and Ike at the 4 and the 5. Your 6, 7, 8 in this situation would be Nolan, Hickman, Ben Gregg, and Dusty Stromer. In whatever order, I think Hickman and Gregg would probably be the top bench options. Stromer kind of fills out that 8th man role. That puts Perry, Huff, and Tui again out of the rotation. The big question here, I think Hickman and Venters would compete for that starting role. I would love to see a lineup. This lineup is one of my favorite options. If Yeo is ready to roll, this lineup is so fun because Nembhard is 6 foot, but then Venters is 6'7", Yeo is 6'8", Watson is 6'8", 6'9", Ike is 6'9". You have 4 starters between 6'7" and 6'9". That in the WCC, that is just an absolute mess for opposing teams to handle. Against bigger physical teams that have 6'10", 6'11", 7-foot guys, you might run into some issues. But again, Gonzaga is going to probably run into those issues regardless because they just don't have a lot of really big players on the roster. It's part of the reason Connor Vanover has been a target that I'm interested in, but I just don't think they have room for him with the front court players that they already have. And I think the other thing is that Hickman and Venters would compete for that starting spot. I wouldn't be shocked if Yeo is ready to go if they started Nembhard, Hickman, Yeo, Watson, Ike, and then had Venters coming off the bench. Zags love their 2-point guard lineups. I think Nembhard and Hickman starting together is a very likely outcome for next year, but I think it's possible if Yeo is ready to go that they bring Hickman back off the bench and slide Venters into that 2-guard role. Other options, I think Ben Gregg could start over Graham Ike. I don't think that's impossible. I have not laid out any scenarios where that is the case, but I want to acknowledge that I think it's possible that Watson and Gregg start and Ike comes off the bench. I already said this earlier, but I think Alex Tui is probably redshirting. It wouldn't surprise me, at least, if he ends up getting on the red shirt. And then again, Perry and Huff could push their way into the rotation. I just have a hard time seeing over who. Unless Ike is hurt, like I said, I'm not sure who they would play over, but they're two very talented players when they're healthy, and I think there's a chance that those guys compete for some kind of playing time during the season. Well, we're going to close out today's show taking a look at Courtney Vandersloot's start to her first WNBA season with the Knicks, with the Liberty, and her recent comments about a career after basketball is over, coming up right after this. Courtney Vandersloot is absolutely killing it with her first start with the New York Liberty, and her scoring is down, but we're talking about 5-game sample size. I want to be clear. They've played 5 games as we're recording this podcast. They are 4-1 in the super team era. The New York Liberty added Breanna Stewart from the Seattle Storm. They, of course, still had Sabrina Ionescu. They added Jonquel Jones, former MVP. They added Courtney Vandersloot. They have a ridiculously loaded team, and you're not surprised they're 4-1 with that kind of talent. Playing about 31 minutes per night. She's averaging only 9 points, which is one of the lowest of her career, but she's averaging 8.6 assists. She's averaging 3 boards. She's also averaging a career high 1.2 blocks, which I think is probably just small sample size noise. Same with her field goal percentage. She's only shooting 17.6% from 3, but it's in a very, very small sample size. She's also 100% from the free throw line, which is not exactly going to keep up. But still, a really nice start to the season for her. She's third on the team in scoring behind Stewart, who's averaging 24.5 per game already. She already had a 50-point game. She's a remarkable scorer. Ionescu's at 13.8 per game, and then Sloot and Jonquel Jones are tied at 9 points per game. Right now, Sloot is 172 assists away from moving into sole possession of second place all-time in assists, passing Ticha Penicheiro. She needs 20 games to get there at her current average. If she stays averaging 8.6 points per game, she will get there on her 20th game of the season. The Liberty have 34 games remaining. If Courtney averages 5.05 assists per game, she will get there this season. Barring an injury, knock on wood, Courtney should move into second place in WNBA assists history this season. She's still 805 assists away from Sue Bird, which I did the math. She would need to average 23.5 assists per game. That's not going to happen this season. It might happen next season. More than likely, it's 2 seasons away if she continues to play that long, which is what I want to talk about to close out the show. Courtney Vandersloot, in an article released by the Chicago Sun-Times, written by the great Annie Costabile, Courtney talked about her post-playing career. And she wants to go into the front office. She mentioned that this has always been something she's been interested in while she was with the Sky. The Sky had a general manager / coach in James Wade, and James, he worked with her a lot. He had a lot of input from her on financial decisions, on roster decisions. And then she got to the Liberty, and she's been working with their general manager, Jonathan Kolb. And she likes that he's separate, and she acknowledged that. I don't think she wasn't saying anything negative about her time with the Sky, but she was basically just saying, I liked working with the general manager who's not also the coach, and kind of getting to see what that experience is like. And both Jonathan Kolb and James Wade have acknowledged, like, they think Courtney would be perfect for a front office role. And I would love to see more WNBA players get into front office roles. I think it's so valuable to have that experience as a player. I think there's value in having non-players in those roles too. I think you need a little bit of a balance. But when you look at the WNBA and the things that people really want to change, more roster spots, more teams in general, having a taxi squad of players so you're not having to cut as many really talented players. All of these things I think could potentially be driven by having more former players in leadership roles. General managers aren't the ones who make a lot of those decisions. It's usually team owners. But having more former players in those roles, I think, is a positive thing for a lot of reasons. Namely, I do think that it could help instigate some of the changes that I believe and many others believe should happen in the WNBA. I think that it's criminal how many players are getting cut from rosters, how many first-round picks aren't even making it because these rosters are so shallow. There's so few teams, and there's not a G League affiliate or a taxi squad or anything like that. And I would hope that more players going into roles of prominence where they have some authority, they have some cachet, could help spur some of those changes. Courtney is an extraordinarily intelligent woman, obviously an incredibly gifted basketball player, and I think putting her in a role where she gets to make some of those decisions would be really beneficial for the entire WNBA. It would, of course, be cool as Gonzaga fans to see her kind of excel in that kind of role as well, but I think it would be objectively good for the game of basketball. We'll continue to keep you updated on Courtney as the season goes on. I'm very excited for when she passes Penicheiro to be the second all-time assist leader in the WNBA. Hopefully a few years from now, we can talk about her passing Sue Bird. I would love for that to be something that happens, for John Stockton and Courtney Vandersloot to be the all-time leaders in assists in their respective sports. And once again, I've said this on the show before, but David Stockton is moving up the all-time G League assist leader as well. Not sure if he'll ever get there, but that would be a really, really fun story if Gonzaga alumni held the assist records in the NBA, WNBA, and G League. All right, that is going to do it for me today. Plenty more coming your way this week. We're going to continue to talk NBA draft stuff with Strother and Timmy. We're going to continue to look at Gonzaga's roster next season, continue to update you on transfer portal stuff as it is relevant, all right here on the Locked On Zags podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube as well. Go hit that subscribe button if you have not done so yet. But for now, I want to thank every single one of you for listening. And of course, as always, go Zags.